as nastily as she knew how. She wished the coach would move. It was Sunday, and everything in London was shuttered and closed and sooty and black. All the church bells were ringing, a persistent, irritating cacophony. Not far from the White Bear in Piccadilly was St. James's Church, which, reflected Lady Beatrice sourly, seemed to have a more hellish group of bell-ringers than most, as they performed their jangly, insistent triples and majors. What did the workers of the world, after toiling 6 miserable days a week, think of this day of rest, black and more miserable than all the others, dingy and stale and dull, thought Lady Beatrice. How could one think of spiritual things when no prospect pleased, and the air was rent by the clamour of the bells? She glanced briefly at her fellow passengers. Beside her was a small, dumpy man who smelled strongly of ale, and beside him, in the other corner, was a tired, bedraggled woman with a snivelling child on her lap. Across from her was a soldier, asleep with his mouth open. Beside him, a small dwarf of a woman with huge pale eyes like saucers, and opposite Lady Beatrice was a thin lady, elegantly dressed. She had sandy hair under a neat bonnet, a crooked nose, odd eyes which appeared to change colour, and a clever mouth. Lady Beatrice's chilly gaze rested a bit longer on this lady than it had done on the others. To her surprise, the lady smiled and said, "Allow me to introduce myself. I am Miss Hannah Pym of London." Lady Beatrice allowed her eyelids to droop slightly, her upper lip to raise a fraction, and then she slowly turned her head away and looked out of the window. Miss Hannah Pym bit her lip in mortification. Although Hannah now had the appearance, clothes, manner and speech of a lady, inside lurked the servant she all too recently had been, and she thought the cold and beautiful creature opposite had snubbed her because she had recognised in Hannah an inferior person. She covertly studied the haughty lady. Lady Beatrice had jet-black hair under a Lavinia bonnet, her face shadowed by the wide brim. She had very clear white skin, a straight nose, and large grey eyes fringed with thick lashes. Her mouth was slightly pinched at the corners, as if it had once been a fuller mouth which the years and disappointment had thinned down. Hannah sensed that she was tired and anxious, and yet Hannah was disproportionately worried by that snub, if snub it had been. Her legacy of £5,000, left her by her late employer Mr. Clarence in his will, had initially seemed a vast sum, but now that she had become accustomed to higher society in the shape of Mr. Clarence's brother, Sir George, who had recently taken her out to the opera, and since she had moved her quarters to the fashionable West End, it seemed very little in a world where men and women gambled more than that at the gaming tables of St. James's every night. And yet, just a little while ago, she had been Hannah Pym of Thornton Hall in Kensington, a housekeeper who had clawed her way up the servants' hierarchy from scullery maid. Her thoughts drifted back over the years. She should not despise her old life. She had been well treated, particularly by pretty Mrs. Clarence before she had run off with that footman and left her husband to sink into apathy. The hard times had come when Mr. Clarence had become a semi-recluse, locking up half the rooms and dismissing half the servants, and there were no more balls or parties. That was when Hannah had begun to watch the stagecoaches, or flying machines as they were called, hurtle along the road at the end of the estate, symbols of freedom and adventure. This was to be her 4th journey. The past 3 had been full of adventure. She sighed a little. She was a determined matchmaker, and there was no one on this coach she could possibly pair together in her mind. Her footman was on the roof with the outside passengers. Hannah brightened. It surely increased her social standing to have a footman. She had adopted her deaf and dumb footman, Benjamin, during her last adventurous journey. He expressly did not want wages. In fact, he had an embarrassing habit of paying her out of his frequent winnings at dice. The chilly lady opposite turned her gaze on Hannah again. Hannah immediately said airily, "I do hope my poor footman is not getting a soaking up on the roof." A slight look of contempt flicked across the fine eyes opposite. Hannah cursed herself and wished she had never spoken.
To keep listening to this audiobook, I've left you a link in the description so you can do it, at no cost thanks to Audible's 30-day free trial.